Catastrophe has been in vogue, actually for a number of years. Television shows with a dystopian future are very popular. It seems as a culture we have a sense that the world could end at any time. And we're sort of energized, motivated, and captivated by this picture of doom. Our Advent sermons have been walking through the long destruction of God's holy land and God's holy people. From Hosea and Josiah and Jeremiah, the northern kingdom is taken apart by the Assyrians. The southern kingdom is destroyed and the temple destroyed by the Babylonians, and the brightest and best of Judah are flung into exile. Most of the Jewish people, by the time both of those kingdoms are destroyed, now become citizens and subjects of these great pagan empires that ruled that area of the world. The Romans, of course, the Jews, a remnant would come back, as we saw last week, and they would build or rebuild the temple, smaller, less glorious. Herod would try to posture himself as a Messiah. He would rebuild the temple again, larger, more glorious, but everyone understood that for Herod, this was a political vanity project, and he really hoped that if he would rebuild the temple, that he would be celebrated by the people, but he didn't fool anyone. They knew what kind of a corrupt politician he was. And so the Advent sermons have been sort of a slow-moving apocalypse. Now the truth is, my friend Jonathan Peugeot has this series on an online channel about the end of the world. But the truth is, our worlds end all the time. Because a world for us isn't just the whole planet and all of its occupants. Sometimes it's a nation. Sometimes it's a culture. Sometimes it's a business. Sometimes it's a family. Sometimes it might even be just a chapter of our lives. It's not unusual as a pastor to go to someone when they have suffered a grievous loss, the loss of a spouse, the loss of a child, or even the disability of a child, where a dream ends and they'll tell you, my world ended that day. Now, this is a picture taken in 1905 of my great-great-grandfather Hartog. You can see him over there. You see him? His name is Hartog. He's got grandson Harry on his lap. This was probably 10 years after he emigrated from the Netherlands. Either he or his father had married a Dutch wife and was put out of the Jewish community. He came over first, Saka, my great-grandfather. You can see him there in back, wearing a hat. Hartog at the time of this picture was 71 years old. And he came to America with 2 sons and 3 daughters. And Saka, who was not the firstborn, was sent over when he was 18. He was probably the oldest capable male. Andrew, Saka's brother, I figured out, was likely disabled. He never married. He lived with his parents his whole life. He seemed to they lived in a farming community, so he probably did odd jobs in gardens, things like that. He's there in the picture standing next to his brother Saka. Saka would come over at 18 or 19, and by this point, in western Michigan, he had met Katie. And he, another Dutch immigrant, and he and Katie were married. And in this picture, there was Harv, their oldest, down at the bottom, and Hiram, who wasn't probably maybe a year old there. They dressed their baby boys in little white dresses, as you can see. That wasn't unusual for the time. Harv was kind of an anglicized name. He was actually named Hartog after his grandfather. And Hiram, my grandfather, was named Hyman after his great-grandfather. And here in 1905, Hartog gathered his son, his 2 sons, and his 3 daughters with their husbands. And here are all of the children. I worked on this, got all of the in-laws and all of the children named. 1905, probably a celebratory picture in the summer or fall of 1905. Hartog proudly with all of his offspring, children and grandchildren. This picture was taken in 1910 of just Saka and Katie, and in the intervening 5 years, they had 4 more children. My grandfather is the one getting his head adjusted by his grandmother so he can be in the picture. And here they are, a family living in Spring Lake, Michigan. Same spot, it seems that the picture was taken before. What they wouldn't know is that in the next year, Katie would die in childbirth. And that little girl in pigtails right there would also die of diphtheria, all of the next year. That's what the world is like. Now we should praise God that we feel these tragedies, but they don't seem to come quite as often as they used to at the beginning of the 20th century. Here's Hartog, probably around 90 years old. He shrunk quite a bit. The years have worn on his face. He's standing next to my grandfather, at this point probably either a college student or a seminarian studying for his life to come. The other pictures, I didn't get a picture of Saka, my great-grandfather, in there, but in the upper picture, which has my father and my grandfather and Raina, which would be my great-grandfather's second wife. She was the sister-in-law of his wife. She came to take care of all the children. And the picture they're sitting in front of, in many ways, represents my great-grandfather, who died of a stroke the day that my grandfather and grandmother had set their wedding. Let's hope you two don't have the same bad luck. The wedding had to be canceled, and there was just a quiet private ceremony as my grandfather and his wife and the rest of the family waited while the stroke took my great-grandfather's life. He was in his 50s. The picture below is my father and myself and my great-grandmother, Raina, who raised my grandfather after his biological mother died. The obituaries from Spring Lake, Michigan. There was another one, too. They said Hartog was known around town. He was kind of a character. Worlds end. Sometimes quickly, sometimes surprisingly. And they do for all of us. One of the videos that I talked about this week on my channel was this video talked about the meta crisis. It talked about the fact that most of us, for at least since the end of World War II, have been aware of the possibility of nuclear annihilation in the world. Wars crop up. Today there's a war in Ukraine. We're anxious about China's desire to, by force, reunify Taiwan into its midst. And will that bring another war? We have anxieties about economic collapse. Government printed a lot of money during this last pandemic and has an enormous national debt. What happens if the world decides to get off the dollar? We don't know. We're worried about ecological collapse. All this industrialization, putting things into the atmosphere. Will the climate warm? Will the sea levels rise? We worry about superbugs and superviruses. We just endured a pandemic. One of the things that are really on people's minds right now are artificial intelligence. All of these little machines that we are making that are deciding banking and attention and culture. We feel culture getting more and more polarized, and we wonder, will there be political violence? Will America be able to hold together? Will little nanobots that get into the soils or get into our bodies destroy the world? We don't know. There are more things we know, most of them by our own hands, that can absolutely absolutely destroy this world civilization that we simply assume right now, and all of the economics and politics that are attached to it, than anything we've ever been aware of in the course of human history. Actually, the new baddie that is making the rounds on the internet now is actually population collapse. Every nation that has a per capita income of greater than $5,000, not a month, but a year, is experiencing the fact that we are not having enough children to replace the current population. And you might say, well, that sounds like a good thing because we're worried about the environment. But actually, if you're living off Social Security or investments, what happens when there are fewer and fewer workers trying to support more and more elderly people? You might say, well, I have enough money in the bank. Well, what will that money be worth? And in fact, we simply don't know. We've never had a situation within any of our lifetimes, within actually any of human history, when we've had major global population collapse. There have been some episodes, like the Black Death, like certain downfalls, like certain cold winters where you had temporary ones, but we've never seen anything like this. What happens in the world? We don't know. All of these things come together and create anxiety. Niall Ferguson, a historian, wrote a book called Doom. He wrote it during the pandemic. And he noted that, in fact, these anxieties have always been with us. The world of the Jews collapsed when the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Greeks and the Persians and the Romans basically treated them as a client state. World scale. And in fact, this historian goes through all of both the anxiety of the world and the collapse of the worlds to see that, in fact, in most cases, our response to the impending doom brought the doom on quicker. That's what we saw in the case of Judah and Israel. All of their attempts to secure themselves made the end come faster. Worlds fall and end and disappear all the time. The Spanish came to Mesoamerica and South America, and the Incas and the Aztecs disappeared. Many of you were alive. I was just an infant when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, but people tell me when they got the news, they wondered what would happen. Would there be war? Did the Russians do it? An era ended when JFK was assassinated, and a vision of the future no longer looked like it did. Same thing happened on 9/11. Those planes crashed into buildings, and we wondered what would happen. This is the way the world goes. Worlds big and small end. We teeter on a precipice. Now, the brightest and the best talk about this. And how can we get people to be more generous? How can we get people to not act so much in their own self-interest? How can we get people to not take advantage of the weak? How can we not overconsume again and again and again? So many good people acting in their own self-interest or the interest of the group, but collectively creating an unintended consequence that puts everyone at risk. Almost everyone grasping for a centralized way of securing our future. One of the scholars in this mix, Ian McGilchrist, very interesting guy, talks about the two sides of the brain, how all of us have actually these two sides of the brain, and they work differently. One side, the left side, he calls the emissary, usually controls why most of us are right-handed, all about the details, all about securing, all about managing, all about trying to get for ourselves what we want and we need and to make ourselves feel safe. Now the other side of the brain, which is really the master, sees the open possibilities and the open questions. But the difficulty is that the side of the brain that does all of the controlling and accounting as a society has sort of grabbed control, and it's ironic that even in this conversation, the answer we have is, okay, how can we secure for ourselves the future that we want? And we scramble for it, and we take advantage of each other for it. And the world is a race to secure myself at your expense. The irony of the whole conversation was that all of our grasping after insured, secure solutions are emissary left-brain types of thinking. It's our own survival grasping that has led to all of our catastrophes. How can we stop the Japanese? Make a super bomb. Oh, America has the super bomb. The Russians get the super bomb. We need more super bombs than them. We all have enough super bombs so we can destroy the world. Well, what are we going to do about viruses? Well, let's take some viruses and make them super viruses so we can figure out how to defeat them. Oops, got out of the lab. Again and again and again, our solutions become our problem. I'm worried about the future, so I'm going to pile up a bunch of money. Then what do I think about? How can I keep my money? You don't escape the anxiety, you just put it somewhere else. This has always been the way of the world. The Bible is the story of the end of the world and the end of many worlds in between. Humanity is the emissary, but it's a grasping, controlling emissary that always seeks to secure itself at the expense of others. God is the master of all the masters. And it's interesting that this conversation about masters and emissaries, they kept bumping into the fact that the master can't act like a tyrant, or the cycle just continues. Can the emissaries trust the master? The question goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And you see it played out with Israel. God rescues Israel from Egypt. Israel goes into the desert. Israel can't trust God. Give us meat. Give us water. Help us to be in charge of our future. God gives Israel the law. Israel can't keep the law. Israel again and again finds itself in bondage, even in the land of promise. The temple is destroyed, rebuilt again, but the bondage doesn't end. It just takes different forms. And then a new story begins, and it's a very strange one. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. The Romans, they're in charge. God's holy land and God's holy people are now once again due for political taxation and control from a blood-stained pagan potentate, and they have to do his will. This is the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone had to go to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and lineage of David. And he went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and expecting a child. Is this the time when you really want to make a 60-mile journey on foot with your pregnant wife because the Roman Empire wants to tax you more clearly? But yet they go. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. And she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no guest room available for them. I showed you the picture of Katie. It was her 6th child that took her life. I remember doing a class in the Dominican Republic of of families, of couples, of men and women. And I asked the class, how many of you have had one of your children die before the age of 5? Every single hand went up. Imagine a scared mother. She's just journeyed farther than any of us have ever journeyed on foot, quite likely. She got down to a place which is overrunning, again, because the empire says jump and everyone says how high. I'm sure she had hoped to give birth in her own home with her mother or her aunts around to help with the labor. She had never done it before. This was her first child. Some of you have given birth. Some of you have been with spouses giving birth, and you know it's a scary thing. That baby coming, the blood, the pain, the yelling, no hospital, no doctor, usually just someone who is skilled, a midwife. We don't even know if she had that. She gives birth in a place where animals are kept. You've all been in a barn. You know what it's like. The cleanest place to lay the baby is the feeding trough. Well, why do you lay the baby there? Because, well, if you've been in a labor and delivery room, once that baby is out, it's a happy exhaustion if everything is healthy and if the mother doesn't bleed out, but it's an exhaustion because how long did she labor? Did everything go well? Well enough that mother and child survived. So you lay the baby in a feeding trough, and you wrap him in what today would probably be looked on as rags. Strips of cloth that no longer had other uses for it. The King of the universe in a manger in rags. And we wonder, this is the Master's plan for what salvation looks like? Now, it seems God couldn't hold himself back. When the Kings win, they light that beam to let everyone in Sacramento know they won the game. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. When that little beam goes up, it's like, oh, look, there's that purple beam. The Kings must have won. Usually in the Bible, when one angel shows up, people hit the deck. The whole sky is filled with them, and you can just imagine the shepherds on the ground in terror, probably hiding their eyes. But the angel said to them, do not be afraid. It's what the angels always say. If they come with a ball, they come and terrify us. Do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. That joy would be delayed, but it would come. Today, in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. It's the strangest possible sign. They would have imagined a royal court and an entourage and all of the splendor that the birth of a prince would bring, but not this prince. Suddenly a great company of the heavenly host appeared with the angel, praising God and saying, glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace on those whom his favor rests. He doesn't send angels to the synagogue leaders in advance of the weary couple to organize proper accommodations. He terrifies a group of men having to work nights protecting sheep. The beam isn't lit from earth to heaven, but from heaven to earth. The Master has sent his emissary, and he's going to do a work that none of our little controlling schemes could ever have imagined. None of us would have written it this way. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has told us about. So they hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby, who was lying in the manger. And when they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told to them about the child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds said to them. But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. Now our assumption is that, well, this changes everything. Now everyone is going to go and take Mary and Joseph and put them in the best place, and all the important people of Bethlehem. I'm sure a lot of people heard the crazy stories by the shepherds and thought, when you're out there all night keeping watch over the sheep, you know what these shepherds are probably doing? What do you think shepherds do at night out there in the cold? Some believed Mary just ponders. The shepherds were clearly moved, and the people seemed to believe their stories. And the stories apparently lingered long enough for Luke to catch them and put them in his gospel. But it doesn't change the way people go. It's like miracles. Pastor, I want a miracle. And then a miracle happens, and they're happy for the next few days. Months, years later, they might still remember the miracle, but they live just like they lived before. Mary, it seems, is wise and patient. She ponders, wondering, knowing enough to know that her knowledge is limited. What on earth does all of this mean? We so long for the salvation widget that we can wield to save us from our lists of doom. That's what we want. Ooh, this is pinching, fix that. This is pinching, fix that. But it's a game of whack-a-mole. There's no end to the things that can take us out. All of our wielding seems to just pile on the doom. The strangeness of the story doesn't stop with the fact that the shepherd's testimony to the angel's messaging doesn't change the rational hearts and minds of human beings. Life will go on pretty much as normal. Jesus spends 30 years just living as a young Jewish man without making too big of a splash as far as they can tell. Where there's that incident in the temple when he's 12, but there's no group gathered around him expecting Jesus to take out the Romans. In fact, the people of his hometown kind of are dismayed by the fact that he's so ordinary. And when he shows himself to be extraordinary, they're even more bothered. People are funny. He has this Galilean moment where everyone gets jazzed up about his potential, but then they're angry because he doesn't capitalize on his prosperity to do the rational, political, military thing. He throws it all away by heading to Jerusalem into the hands of the two most powerful factions at war with each other, but could agree that they'd like Jesus done away with. And they kill him. And he doesn't die spitting curses at his enemies. He says things like, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. These clueless, human, rational organizer managers just keep causing problems for themselves. And the Savior of the world comes, and they kill him. And they don't understand that actually they're following in a script that is, in fact, going to save the world. When his disciples claim he rose from the dead and hung out with them for another 40 days or so, he doesn't pop over to gloat over Pontius Pilate or Herod. He ascends into heaven. And his followers begin to believe he's actually ruling this world from heaven, and all the strangeness and mystery that his birth revealed. From there, his followers, who look more hapless than the shepherds, proceed to start something that overturns the Roman Empire in 300 years and continues to rewrite our moral imaginations, whether we believe in him or not. If there's one thing to deduce from the world, it's that